I thought the day I buried my husband of 40 years, Richard, was the darkest day of my life. But it turned out that day was only the opening act, the moment the curtain fell over my eyes. The real storm broke later in that cold room where the will was read. When that envelope was opened, it wasn't just property and inheritance that spilled out. It was the revelation of a terrible second life my husband had kept hidden from me.
It had only been 3 days since the funeral. I was still searching for Richard's scent in every corner of our house, mourning with a pure, untainted grief, unaware that those beautiful years we had shared were built on a terrible lie. But my sorrow, I would soon learn, was nothing compared to what awaited me, because people only cry for what they know, not for the betrayal still hidden from them. When the solicitor called, I thought it was about the usual tedious formalities, the inheritance certificate, the property transfer, the paperwork that follows death. After all, Richard had always said that everything he owned would go to our only son, Edward, and me. He was a family man, or so I believed. Still, there was something in the solicitor's cold, measured tone, the way he insisted that I had to be present for the reading of the will, that planted an unexplainable seed of unease inside me. I told myself it was just exhaustion, grief playing tricks on my nerves. The next morning, as I walked into the solicitor's office with Edward and especially my daughter-in-law Charlotte, they looked less like mourners and more like executives stepping out of a boardroom. Their hushed whispers about what part of the estate might come to them shattered what little was left of my heart. While I was grieving my husband, they were calculating their inheritance. I didn't see it then, but that was the first warning sign of the betrayal to come. When we entered the waiting room, I noticed 2 other people sitting there, a pale, timid woman and a young man in his 20s beside her. It never once crossed my mind what they could possibly be doing there or how they might be connected to my late husband. I couldn't have known that this strange encounter was the beginning of the secret that would shatter the foundations of the life I had so carefully built over 40 years. When Mr. Martin, the solicitor, finally ushered us into that lifeless meeting room, the air inside felt colder than the rain outside. As we sat around the large polished table, the presence of those 2 strangers opposite my son and daughter-in-law filled me with an uneasy, gnawing tension that had nothing to do with grief. I noticed Charlotte gripping her expensive handbag in irritation, while Edward stared at the solicitor with the arrogant impatience of a man eager to claim his father's seat. In their eyes, there was no trace of loss, no solidarity with my pain, only the greedy anticipation of the numbers sealed inside that envelope and the luxury those numbers would buy. Mr. Martin cleared his throat and gave us that professional, emotionless look. "Mrs. Ellis, Mr. Ellis," he began, then turned toward the pale woman. "As per the late Mr. Richard Ellis's explicit request, I must also introduce our other guests whose presence is required for the reading of the will. Mrs. Hannah Carter and her son, Benjamin Carter." Hannah and Benjamin. I searched the farthest corners of my 40-year memory through Richard's family, business contacts, social circles, for any trace of those names. Nothing. My mind returned only silence, because those people had never existed in my world. While Edward muttered impatiently, "Let's get this over with, Mr. Martin. I've got a company to run." And Charlotte shot the woman a contemptuous glance. I felt my anxiety rising. Then Mr. Martin picked up that cursed sealed envelope. The rustle of the paper filled the room as he said, "I will now begin reading the final wishes of the late Mr. Richard Ellis." And with those words, the life I thought I knew officially came to an end.
As Mr. Martin's voice began to echo through the room, formal, detached, almost mechanical, my ears caught words like debts, taxes, legal obligations. But my mind refused to process any of it. All I was waiting for, holding my breath for, were my husband's final words to me and to our son. That familiar line I thought I would hear. "I leave all my possessions to my beloved wife Margaret and my son Edward." The first sound that broke the dreadful silence was the scrape of a chair. Edward shot to his feet, shouting, "What is this nonsense?" He glared at the solicitor, then at the strange woman across the table. Charlotte's face, the same face that had once dreamed of luxury holidays and country estates, had turned ghostly white. Her greed now replaced by a burning rage. But I wasn't thinking of their anger. I was thinking of the cottage in Brighton, our summer house by the sea. That place was my youth, the place where I raised our son, where Richard and I reconciled after every argument. And now, my husband, the man I had loved and trusted for 40 years, had left that house filled with my memories to a woman and a young man whose names I had never even heard before. It wasn't just an inheritance that had been taken from me. It was the violation of everything I held sacred. While Edward kept shouting, "This will is a fraud. My father wasn't in his right mind. I'll contest this immediately." Mr. Martin struck the table sharply and said, "Please, sit down, Mr. Ellis. There's more to the will. This is only the beginning." He cleared his throat again, preparing to deliver the final blow. Then he said it, that dreadful phrase that shattered my world. "And to the late Mr. Ellis's other son, Benjamin Carter," those two words, "other son," exploded in my ears like a bomb. They didn't just shatter the silence, they froze time itself. Even Edward's furious shouting faded into a dull hum as the words "other son" kept echoing inside my skull, thick and poisonous, coating every memory I had of my husband and our life together. It was Edward's violent outburst that pulled me back into the moment. He was pounding his fists on the solicitor's desk, yelling, "What son? What are you talking about? Who are these impostors to claim my father's estate? I am his only son." The wild fury in his eyes wasn't the grief of a bereaved child. It was the primal rage of a predator losing its prey. Charlotte, still reeling from the shock of losing the seaside house, now stared at the young man named Benjamin with cold, burning hatred. Her expression wasn't pain, it was contempt, sharpened by the thought that our money, our luxury, might now go to these pitiful strangers. Then the young man who had sat silently until that moment, Benjamin, slowly stood up. His face twitched with anger as Edward's insults rang in his ears. With a voice like ice, he hissed, "Shut your mouth. While you were enjoying your father's fortune at the company, my mother and I were surviving on the scraps that same man threw our way." That voice carried more than a claim to inheritance. It was the eruption of years of humiliation, abandonment, and buried fury. At that moment, nothing else mattered.
Not the Brighton house, not the money, not the shares in the company. The only thing echoing in my mind was the truth. The man I had shared a bed with for 40 years, the man I thought I knew, had lived another life. While I ironed his shirts, cooked his meals, raised his son, he had been giving his love, his time, his fatherhood to another woman and another child. And I realized my entire life had been built upon a magnificent, merciless lie.
Benjamin's cold confession hit us like a grenade thrown into the middle of the room. For a brief second, my son Edward froze in disbelief, but the shock quickly turned into fury, sharpened by the fear of losing everything he thought was his. Your father? What father? You and your mother are nothing but a pair of con artists who swindled my dad, he shouted, lunging toward the young man as if ready to strike him. In the middle of the chaos, the pale-faced woman, Hannah, who had been silent like a ghost until then, pulled a worn, folded photograph from her handbag with trembling hands and pushed it toward the table. "We're not liars," she said, her voice breaking. "When Richard told me he loved me 25 years ago, I had no idea he was married." Her tone wasn't that of an intruder. It was the shattered voice of another woman deceived by the same man, another victim of his lies. When my eyes fell on the photograph, my breath caught in my throat. There was Richard, my Richard, smiling the same familiar smile, but the woman beside him wasn't me, and the baby in his arms looked barely a few years younger than Edward had been at that age. It wasn't a passing affair. It was proof of a second life, a second family, and the realization that my marriage, my home, and my faith had been built on the suffering of another woman. Before I could even process the image, Charlotte cut in, completely indifferent to the devastation consuming me. Turning sharply to the solicitor, she snapped in that shrill, poisonous tone of hers, "This is irrelevant. Those photos could be fake. Mr. Martin, get to the point. What about the company shares? My father-in-law transferred full control to my husband, didn't he?" Even in the midst of moral ruin, her only concern was money. Mr. Martin, visibly unsettled by the uproar, struck the table with his palm to restore order. "Mrs. Ellis, if you would calm down, I was just coming to that part," he said, adjusting his glasses. Then, with a slow, deliberate breath, he continued reading. "The late Mr. Richard Ellis bequeaths all his shares in Ellis Co. Holdings." He paused. That single hesitation, just a few seconds, felt like an eternity to me. For Charlotte and Edward, it was the pause before their triumph. They leaned forward eagerly, hungry for the words that would crown them the heirs of their empire. But for me, that pause was the sound of the last unbroken piece of my life about to shatter. Finally, the solicitor continued, "Bequeaths 51% of his shares to his lawful wife, Margaret Ellis." Edward's lips had already parted in a victorious grin and then froze mid-smile. To me? To me, a woman who had never set foot in her husband's office except as a guest, who had never understood a single figure from his world of meetings and profits? It didn't feel like a gift. It felt like punishment, a heavy, suffocating burden, Richard's final act of control, his last revenge. Then Charlotte cried out, panicked, "And what about Edward? What happens to the remaining 49%?
Mr. Martin looked around the room, then delivered the next blow with quiet precision. The remaining 49% shall go to his other son, Benjamin Carter. Edward's face twisted in rage, unrecognizable. The man his father had raised as the sole heir, the chosen successor, had been left with nothing, not a single share, not a trace of power. He can't do this. He can't erase me from his will. This is a setup, Edward roared, his voice echoing against the walls. Charlotte's scream followed. No, the cars, the houses, the company's income, all of it can't go to them, to those freeloaders. Their cries weren't born of grief. They were the screams of privilege dying. And in that moment, I understood, even in death, Richard Ellis had played his final game, a cruel, calculated move that would turn us all against each other and leave behind nothing but ruin.
My son Edward's threat, "I'll ruin you. I won't leave this fraud unchallenged. You won't even be able to set foot in that company," rang hollow next to the deep, gutting betrayal I felt. His anger wasn't about lies. It was only about the money he was about to lose. Charlotte, having exhausted her fury, now sat in a corner, alternating between hysterical laughter and choking sobs. Not the grief of a betrayed wife, but the spoiled collapse of a businesswoman watching her life's investment fail. Amid those frenzied shouts, the other son, Benjamin, looked at Edward with an unnerving calm. "Shout all you want. The will is clear. You always knew who he was, but you kept ignoring us," he said. Those words carried the weight of years of exclusion, the steady accumulation of anger from being left outside the family's legitimate world. And now a man who finally believed justice had come spoke with unshakable resolve. The only person I met eyes with in that moment was the stranger, Hannah. She looked at me with a tired, sorrowful understanding that seemed to say, "Only I know what you went through." Instead of comforting me, that look, the thought that another woman had shared my betrayal, shattered my pride into even smaller pieces. When Mr. Martin announced in his cold official tone, "This meeting is concluded. Legal remedies are available for your objections," I flinched. I watched Edward and Charlotte storm out in rage, while Hannah and Benjamin left quietly. Left alone in that room with the will in my hands, I felt the weight of 51% of an empire and the ruins my husband left behind crushing my shoulders. For the first time in my life, I had no idea what to do next. I have no memory of how I left that freezing office, walked down the marble corridors, or got into my car. My mind was numb and my heart heavy, as if I were a stranger trapped inside my own body. Each raindrop streaking the window felt like the silent mirror of the poisoned tears I would not permit myself to show. When I stepped back through the front door of the vast house I had spent 40 years decorating with love, my refuge had become a cold tomb, a monument to my husband's lies. The family photographs on the walls, those staged smiles, they hit me like proof of the monstrous lie I believed and the foolishness of my blind trust. In my husband's study, his expensive fountain pen and the half-finished notebook on his desk seemed fresh, as if he might return at any moment. and I realized with a fresh horror that the endless nights he told me were long meetings at the office, the nights I waited for him alone, hoping for him to come home, had been spent in another life, in Hannah's house, in a parallel family he kept hidden from me. Standing before the mirror in our bedroom, my hand went to the diamond necklace at my throat without thinking. He had placed it on me on our 25th anniversary, saying, "You are my only harbor, Margaret." As he looked into my eyes, I felt bile rise as I understood the truth. That necklace was not proof of a love that sustained me, but a brilliant bribe, a costly hush to hide the existence of his other son, Benjamin. Sitting hopelessly on the edge of that large bed, the burning weight of that 51% share finally landed on me. Perhaps Richard had placed me there to be crushed beneath the wreckage, to drown me in the complexities of a business I never understood. But something began to stir, a different power born from the ashes of the deceived woman I had been, a strength fed by pain and anger. If he had left me this empire, then under its ruins I would not allow my son's greed nor my husband's lies to remain.
As I sat hunched in my husband's study, sunk into the darkness under the weight of his lies and the enormous shares on my shoulders, the front door burst open as if it had been kicked in. The sound of footsteps coming toward me wasn't there to comfort the grieving widow. It screamed that they had come to strip away the last thing I had left. It was Edward and Charlotte. Charlotte had dropped her fake respectful mask completely and stood before me like a stranger with eyes glittering with greed and rage. "You knew everything, didn't you?" she hissed, ignoring the fact that my world had just collapsed. "You knew he had a family among those scroungers, and you kept quiet so the company would go to you. You sold us out. You sacrificed your own son for money." Edward, cold and emotionless in a way I had never seen before, behaved less like a mourning son and more like an enraged businessman who had just lost a lucrative contract. Without once asking, "Are you all right, Mum?" he shoved a sheaf of papers onto the coffee table, pages clearly prepared in the heat of his fury outside the solicitor's office, and said, "We all knew Dad had been slipping lately. This will is invalid." When I looked up into the eyes of the son I'd loved and cherished, I did not see my child. I saw a monster willing to trample his own mother to claim his father's fortune. It became crystal clear that their anger was not about my husband's betrayal or my heartbreak. It was about keeping the power and money of Ellis Co. Holdings away from that other son, Benjamin. That realization cut deeper than the betrayal itself. As I kept my silence, Edward's temper boiled over. He leaned forward and spat the poisonous ultimatum. "Either you sign those documents by tomorrow morning, confirming you've handed control of the company to me, or I'll gather my lawyers and prove you were of unsound mind after Dad's death, that you were incapacitated, and have you placed under guardianship. I'll take the company from you that way." The words, "place you under guardianship," stabbed not only at my wounded heart, but at my pride as a mother. In that instant, I understood the man before me was not the innocent boy I had comforted through fevers and nights of worry. he had inherited his father's greed and cruelty. He would gladly lock his mother away to seize her inheritance. Charlotte poured fuel on that monstrous offer. In her high, poisonous voice, she said, "Edward's right, Mum. Do you really think you can run that enormous company in your grieving, confused state? That mongrel boy and his fake mother will strip you bare within days. Sign now and spend your remaining years peacefully in a care home." At the single word care home, the helpless sorrow and victimhood I'd felt froze and was replaced by a cold, razor-sharp rage I had never known lived in me. Even the pain of my husband's deceit paled beside the filthy selfishness of my own son and daughter-in-law plotting to bury me alive. I stood up, not knowing where the strength had come from, and when my voice came out, it was stronger and clearer than I had expected. It was as if the 51% share in the ruined empire it represented were speaking through me. When did you become such cowards that you would threaten your father's wife, your own mother, with a madhouse before his body has even grown cold? I picked up the forged power of attorney papers they had proffered and under their greedy stares tore them slowly into pieces. I let the ribbons of paper fall onto the coffee table. "Now," I said, "get out of this house, out of the heart of the empire my husband left me, and do not ever set foot in these rooms again unless you come back with the legal authority the company has legally given me. The confused woman you threatened to lock away is dead. Standing here now is Margaret Ellis, the majority shareholder of Ellis Co. Holdings."
While I sat hunched in my husband's study, buried in darkness under the weight of his lies and the enormous shares on my shoulders, the front door slammed as if it had been driven in. The footsteps crossing the threshold weren't for consoling the grieving widow. They announced that they'd come to strip away the last thing I had. It was my son, Edward, and my daughter-in-law, Charlotte. Charlotte had dropped her fake, respectful mask and stood before me like a stranger whose eyes glittered with greed and rage. "You knew everything, didn't you?" she hissed, ignoring the ruin of my world. "You knew he had a family among those scroungers, and you kept quiet so the company would go to you. You sold us out. You betrayed your own son for money." Edward, cold and expressionless in a way I had never seen, behaved less like a mourning son and more like an enraged businessman who had just lost a contract. Without once asking, "Are you all right, Mum?" he shoved a stack of papers onto the coffee table, documents evidently prepared in the heat of his fury, and said, "We all knew Dad had been failing lately. This will has no legal validity." When I looked up into the eyes of the son I had loved and sheltered, I did not see my child. I saw a monster ready to trample his own mother to claim his father's fortune. It became painfully clear that their concern wasn't my husband's betrayal or my grief. It was keeping the power and money of Ellis Co. Holdings out of the hands of that other son, Benjamin. That realization cut deeper than the betrayal itself. As I kept my silence, Edward's temper boiled over. He leaned forward and spat his poisonous ultimatum. Either you sign the papers by tomorrow morning confirming you've handed control of the company to me, or I'll gather my lawyers and prove you were of unsound mind after Dad died, that you were incapacitated, and have you placed under guardianship. I'll take the company from you that way. The threat to have me placed under guardianship stabbed not only at my wounded heart, but at my pride as a mother. In that moment, I saw that the man before me was no longer the helpless child I had nursed through fevers. He had inherited his father's greed and cruelty. He would gladly lock his mother away to seize her inheritance. Charlotte poured fuel onto that monstrous offer. In her sharp, poisonous voice, she said, "Edward's right, Mum. Do you really think you can run a massive company in your grieving, confused state? That mongrel boy and his fake mother will strip you bare within days. Sign now and spend your remaining years in a care home." The single word care home froze the helpless sorrow and victimhood I'd felt, and in seconds was replaced by a cold, razor-sharp anger I had never known. Even the pain of my husband's deceit paled against the filthy selfishness of my son and daughter-in-law plotting to bury me alive. I rose to my feet, surprised at the strength in my voice, and when I spoke, it sounded less like me and more like the voice of the 51% shareholder of a ruined empire. When did you become such cowards that you would threaten your father's wife, your own mother, with a madhouse before his body has even grown cold? I picked up the forged power of attorney papers they'd shoved at me, and under their greedy stares, tore them slowly into pieces, letting the ribbons fall onto the coffee table. "Now," I said, "get out of this house, out of the heart of the empire my husband left me, and do not set foot in these rooms again unless you return with the legal authority the company has lawfully given me. The confused woman you threatened to lock away is dead. Standing here now is Margaret Ellis, the majority shareholder of Ellis Co. Holdings."
Sitting in the study that had become the epicenter of my husband's lies, buried in darkness under the weight of betrayal and those enormous shares, I heard the front door slam as if it had been kicked open, and the footsteps that followed were not coming to comfort a grieving widow. They had come to take away the last thing I had. It was my son Edward and my daughter-in-law Charlotte. Charlotte had dropped her fake, respectful mask and stood before me like a stranger, her eyes glittering with greed and rage. "You knew everything, didn't you?" she hissed, as if my world's collapse meant nothing.
You knew he had a family among those scroungers, and you kept quiet so the company would go to you. You sold us out. You betrayed your own son for money." Edward, cold and emotionless in a way I had never seen, behaved less like a grieving son and more like an enraged businessman who had just lost a lucrative contract. Without once asking, "Are you all right, Mom?" he threw a stack of papers on the coffee table, documents clearly prepared in the fury outside the solicitor's office, and said, "We all knew Dad had been failing lately. This will is legally void." When I looked into the eyes of the child I had loved and sheltered, I did not see my boy. I saw a monster willing to trample his own mother to claim his father's fortune. It became horribly clear that their concern was not my husband's betrayal or my pain. It was that they would lose control of Ellis Co. Holdings to that other son, Benjamin. That truth cut deeper than the betrayal itself. As I kept my silence, Edward's rage boiled over. He leaned forward and spat his poisonous ultimatum. "Either you sign these papers by tomorrow morning, confirming you have handed control of the company to me, or I'll get my lawyers and prove you were of unsound mind after Dad's death, that you were incapacitated, and have you placed under guardianship. I'll take the company that way." The threat of guardianship struck not only at the wound in my heart, but at my pride as a mother. In that moment, I understood the man before me was not the helpless child I had nursed. He had inherited his father's greed and cruelty. He would happily lock his mother away to seize her inheritance. Charlotte poured gasoline on that monstrous offer. In her thin, poisonous voice, she said, "Edward's right, Mum. Do you really think you can run a massive company in your grieving, confused state? That other boy and his fake mother will strip you bare within days. Sign now and spend the rest of your life peacefully in a care home." The single word care home froze the helpless sorrow and victimhood I'd felt, and in an instant was replaced by a cold, razor-sharp fury I didn't know I possessed. Even the pain of my husband's deceit paled beside the filthy selfishness of my son and daughter-in-law plotting to bury me alive. I rose to my feet, surprised at the strength in my voice, and when I spoke, it was not merely my voice, but the voice of the 51% shareholder of a ruined empire. When did you become such cowards that you would threaten your father's wife, your own mother, with a madhouse before his body has even grown cold? I took the forged power of attorney papers they had shoved at me, and under their greedy stares tore them slowly into pieces, letting the strips fall onto the coffee table. Now, I said, "Get out of this house, out of the heart of the empire my husband left me, and do not set foot in these rooms again unless you return with the lawful authority this company has granted me." The confused woman you threatened to lock away is dead.
Standing here now is Margaret Ellis, the majority shareholder of Ellis Co. Holdings.
The moment the word security hung in the air, my son Edward's insolent rage froze for a second, replaced by the wounded bewilderment of a child who couldn't quite believe his mother would actually do this to him. It lasted only a heartbeat. The look evaporated and was replaced by something I barely recognized. Eyes turned to blood, pure hatred flooding his face. "You can't do this to me," he roared, upending his chair and charging to his feet. I watched the suited men draw back in fear as he screamed, "I'm your son. You'd sell your own child for that bastard and those money-hungry frauds. My father must be turning in his grave. You'll regret this. I'll have you locked up in a home myself." Even as the security men grabbed at his arms and he flailed like an animal. As they dragged him toward the door, his last look, that "I hate you" glare, pierced deeper than the revelation of my husband's betrayal or the horrors of the will reading. In that instant, I knew I had not only driven a thief from the company, I had lost my child, perhaps forever. That victory tasted like the bloodiest, most terrible triumph of my life. When the corridor swallowed his shouts and the door slammed in his face, the heavy silence that settled over the boardroom revealed a rapid shift. The men who had called me pathetic minutes before were now edging toward my side, addressing me with a nervous, forced respect. "Madam Chair." Their sudden, self-serving loyalty made my stomach turn, but I understood then that I needed exactly that fear to stay standing. Without shedding a single tear, I walked to the great table, to the chair my husband and my son had sat in, and sat down. I looked each of those men in the eye and said with not an ounce of tremor in my voice, "Gentlemen, since the first problem has been dealt with, we will move to the second item on the agenda, a full forensic audit of this holding and a meeting to introduce my new partner, Benjamin Carter, holder of the 49% stake." After I had thrown my son, my own flesh and blood, out of the building like a criminal, and left behind the hypocritical respect of those men, I shut myself in my husband's enormous office. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt the gnawing ache of having watched my child walk himself into ruin. Looking out over the city through that window, I knew I had no right to cry. Sending Edward away had not ended the war. It had opened a more complex and dangerous front. The first audit reports Mr. Martin placed before me revealed something worse than I had imagined. Edward's theft ran far deeper. The company coffers were nearly emptied, and the grand empire my husband had built teetered on the brink of collapse. Only then did Richard's reasoning become horribly clear. He had not handed me a throne, but an exploded ruin, and by placing me on it, he may have intended to see me crushed. He had left me not a gift, but a wreck. Realizing I could not act alone, I made perhaps the hardest decision of my life, and turned to my solicitor. "Call that young man, Benjamin Carter, here. "To my office, immediately," I said. Pride, fury, and a cold, calculating hunger for justice rose inside me. Benjamin was my compulsory 49% partner, and if this company was to be saved, it would be by joining my experience and his youthful ambition, whether I liked it or not. When Benjamin entered the vast office, his fury he'd shown at the will reading had vanished. He stood before me transformed, the same angry young man, but now tempered by curiosity and the strange awe of someone stepping for the first time into his father's opulent world. In his tentative, upright bearing, I saw a bitter summary of Richard's lost 25 years. I didn't bother with perfumed civility. I slid the disaster-stained balance sheet, red numbers, the company's near bankruptcy laid bare, across the desk between us, and said, stripping all emotion from my voice, "Welcome to the inheritance your father left you. You now own 49% of a wreck that's been emptied by your brother's hand. Decide now, will you join me in clearing this ruin, or will you behave like Edward and plunder the last fragments for yourself?"
As soon as the word security echoed in the room, my son Edward's insolent fury froze for a single instant, replaced by the wounded bewilderment of a child who couldn't quite believe his mother would truly do this to him. That moment passed like a snapped thread. Shock was replaced by something blood-hot and foreign in his eyes, pure, white-hot hatred. "You can't do this to me," he roared, tipping his chair and leaping up. I watched the suited men recoil in alarm as he screamed, "I am your son. You'd sell your own child for that bastard and those money-hungry frauds? My father must be turning in his grave. You'll regret this. I'll have you locked up in an institution myself." The security guard seized his arms while he flailed like an animal. As they dragged him down the corridor, his last look, that "I hate you" glare, cut deeper than the revelations in the will reading. In that instant, I understood I had not only expelled a thief from the company, I had likely lost my child forever. That victory tasted of iron and blood. When the door slammed, a heavy hush fell across the boardroom. The men who had minutes before dismissed me as a pathetic, confused woman now edged toward my side, their faces a mixture of fear and reluctant respect. Madam Chair. Their sudden, self-serving allegiance made my stomach turn, yet I knew that fear as ballast to stay upright. Without shedding a tear, I walked to the great table, to the chair my husband and my son had taken, and sat. I surveyed those men and said, with a steadiness I hadn't expected, "Gentlemen, now that the first problem is dealt with, we will move on to the second item on the agenda, a full forensic audit of the holding and an introduction to my new partner, Benjamin Carter, holder of the 49% stake." After I had driven my son, my own flesh and blood, out like a criminal and left behind the hypocritical respect of those men, I retreated to my husband's vast office. There I felt no triumph, only the gnawing ache of having watched my child hurl himself into ruin. Looking down at the city through the glass, I knew there was no time to grieve. Expelling Edward had not ended the war, it had opened a more complex, more dangerous front. The first audit reports Mr. Martin laid before me revealed the truth in full. Edward's theft ran far deeper than I had imagined. The company coffers had been siphoned and the once grand empire teetered on the brink of collapse.
Only then did Richard's cruel logic become clear. He had not handed me a throne, but a ruin, and in doing so had perhaps expected to see me crushed beneath it. He left me a wreck, not a legacy. Realizing I could not fight this alone, I made the hardest decision of my life. Bring that young man, Benjamin Carter, to my office immediately, I told Mr. Martin. Pride and fury and a cold, practical hunger for justice steeled me. Benjamin was my compulsory 49% partner, and if this company was to survive, it would be by combining my will with his youthful determination. When Benjamin entered that great office, the rage I'd seen at the will reading had vanished. He stood before me less like a claimant and more like a man who had come to a ruined inheritance and was trying to decide whether to build or to burn. In him I saw a raw, dangerous resolve, the look of someone who had been excluded and now had a chance for vengeance. I did not bother with perfumed politeness. I pushed the disaster-soaked balance sheet, the red numbers and fake invoices across the desk between us and said, my voice stripped of sentiment, "Welcome to the inheritance your father left you. You own 49% of a wreck emptied by your brother. Decide now, will you join me to clear this ruin, or will you act like Edward and plunder the last scraps for yourself?" For a few seconds, I watched Benjamin's face change. The defeated victim I'd half-pitied hardened into the hungry, dangerous man I'd glimpsed in the will room. He let out a bitter laugh and said, "All those years he called me boy and gave crumbs to me and my mother, and in death he leaves me nothing but debt and ruin." It was, in its way, an admission of how deeply he'd been used. Then the shift came. Hearing Edward's name washed away Benjamin's victimhood and stoked an old hunger for redress. He sat upright, placed his hand on the balance sheet, and looked at me with a dangerous clarity. "I'll save this company on one condition. We recover every penny Edward stole, and from now on, I have real authority here." In that cold, late hour, among folders and blinking screens and sleep-deprived auditors, two of Richard's victims, his lawful wife and his other son, forged a precarious, furious alliance. We were two forced strangers bound by a shared hatred and a single objective: to clear the wreckage of an empire built on lies and to strip power from the vultures that fed on it.
As the sun rose again over that filthy city after the hellish, sleepless night we'd spent in my husband's office, Benjamin and I sat staring at the mountains of forged invoices and the proof of betrayal stacked before us. I felt not only the grief of losing a child, but a cold, clear fury at seeing how the life I had shared with a man for 40 years had been surrounded by a nest of vipers, how the so-called friends he trusted had metastasized over his legacy like a cancer. When Mr. Martin arrived at the office with the first light and I handed him the list, it no longer contained only my ungrateful son Edward's name. It also named the two key executives who had been quickest to bow in that boardroom, my husband's 40-year right hand, the so-called loyal finance director, and 2 other senior figures who had helped run the theft. In that moment, I understood something brutal. I was no longer a grieving wife only preserving a home. I had become a merciless surgeon, forced to cut away everyone, even the most trusted, to save an empire. From my study window, I watched that loyal finance director being marched out of the building by security, protesting, "But Mrs. Ellis, this must be a mistake," his cries swallowed by the corridor. The maternal pain I had felt when I'd thrown my son out was replaced this time by the cold satisfaction of an empress whose throne had been defiled. This man had stolen not only from my company, but from my husband's memory and from the last respect I had for him. Benjamin, watching the man's expulsion, strode into the vacated office, the key financial center of the holding, with the air of a conqueror, and took the first seat he'd ever been allowed. Observing his hungry but calculating posture, I realized that my husband had left his illegitimate son not only a wreck, but the raw intelligence and appetite to rebuild it. Unintentionally, perhaps, he had bequeathed him something like a talent. That day we began to purge the rotten apples one by one. When the corridors finally grew quiet of treacherous whispers, Benjamin and I sat at that enormous table again in the evening. He no longer felt like my husband's mistake. He was my only partner who matched my rage with a sharp, determined hatred. We both understood that the real fight would start outside those doors, against the ones we'd thrown out, Edward and Charlotte. The weeks after we cleansed the malignancy from the holding stripped more from me than a lifetime of luxurious comforts ever had. Benjamin and I worked day and night to keep the wreck afloat. Meetings with banks, endless negotiations with creditors. I learned, like a survivor taught to breathe, the language of cold numbers and balance sheets. I learned the meaning of offshore accounts, shell companies, and money laundering, terms that had lurked at the heart of my sheltered life. For me, those ledgers were not only a bankruptcy report, but the ugly map of the second life my husband had hidden and the depth of my son's theft. Benjamin, however, read those figures differently. To him, the wreck was a battlefield that proved how long he'd been excluded from that rich world, a chance at revenge. Watching him relentlessly chase the fake invoices with the forensic team, I saw in him the same ruthless cunning my husband had once possessed, and a raw will forged by the necessity of survival, a drive Edward had never known. In the small hours, the auditors delivered their final, devastating report. Edward could not have siphoned those millions alone. Beneath the forged signatures and the huge payments to offshore vehicles lay collusion. Even the finance director whom everyone had trusted, the man everyone called my husband's right hand, had been complicit. In that moment, I understood that I had not only expelled an ungrateful son, I had declared war on an entire pack of jackals my husband had gathered around him, a system of betrayal woven into the veins of the holding. Edward was only the greediest tooth of that beast. The true enemy was the network of treachery embedded in the company. My other son, Benjamin, was the only ally left I could trust.